Okay, I'm letting them in. Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. We'll just wait for another minute for other people to join us, but it's wonderful to see so many people today. Well, what do you think? Shall we get started? Yeah? A couple of minutes in, there'll be people joining us as we go along, but maybe I can start anyway. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dimity Hawkins, and along with Pam Kingfisher, I am a co-coordinator of the Nuclear Truth Project. We are absolutely delighted that we have been joined by people from all around the world for this launch of our new report, Challenging Nuclear Secrecy. I'm speaking today from Naarm or Melbourne, Australia, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I would like to pay my respects to the elders of this country and to all the elders who are joining us here today. As people continue to join us, just a little housekeeping first. This webinar is being recorded for those who could not make the hour, wherever they are in the world. We ask that people remain on mute during the speakers, but if you have questions or comments, please start anytime popping them into the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. You are also welcome to share where you're from and whose land you are on, wherever you are in the world. We will have a short while to have Q&A midway through the seminar, but as this is set for just 1 hour, we're asking people to please keep your questions short and to the point when we come to that section. We hold this webinar in a season of nuclear anniversaries of the first use of nuclear weapons, in a time of remembering.
Dimity, you've got, yeah.
Oh, I don't know why I muted there. It's a time of remembering the Trinity test in New Mexico in mid-July, and between the 78th anniversaries of the bombings of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we start too by remembering this day the victims and survivors of these atrocities. Some of you will know about the Nuclear Truth Project, I hope, but a quick introduction for those of you who haven't met us yet. Our project arose out of the pandemic in 2021 in response to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entering into force. The treaty brought a nuclear weapons ban into international law, and to date, there's 92 countries who have signed and 68 who are now full states parties to the ban on nuclear weapons. In the treaty's preamble, it takes special note of the unacceptable suffering and harm caused to the victims of the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon testing. It also recognises the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons activities on Indigenous peoples, as well as the disproportionate impact of ionising radiation on the health of women and girls. Importantly, under Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty, states parties agree to positive obligations on key issues of victim assistance and environmental remediation. For these positive obligations to take effect, affected communities and civil society organisations are increasing their calls for access to official state records on nuclear weapons use and testing. For all of these reasons, this historic treaty has generated much needed focus on those communities most impacted by nuclear weapons. But the harms from nuclear are not restricted to those of weapons alone. Every part of the nuclear chain generates harms to human health and the environment. In our conversations with affected community members and civil society organizations, we have recognized that nuclear secrecy, denial, and obfuscation by industries and governments involved in nuclear activities has been a serious hindrance to our work for nuclear justice. The ongoing realities of nuclear colonialism have dislocated many affected community members from nuclear truths. Our work and the work of many of our partners around the world seeks to address the bias and redress the imbalance in the imposed silences around nuclear harms. So in 2022, the Nuclear Truth Project set out to explore the concept of nuclear archiving as part of our foundational work. The work also reflects our own protocols of rights, respect, and reciprocity when working within or with or alongside affected communities. We quickly learned that there is no easy way to engage in nuclear archives though, so we took a new approach, one that explored the issues around barriers to access, ethics, and hierarchies. The report explores all of these things. It includes a number of case studies and community stories which illustrate these concerns and showcases how researchers and activists from affected communities are responding. This report is offered for those community members particularly, and for civil society organizations and journalists and academic researchers and governments concerned with nuclear accountability. Now to our speakers, we have been extraordinarily lucky to have had 3 amazing people join us to research and write and draw together this report. Let me introduce our first speaker, Marco de Jong. Marco is a Pacific historian and an advocate for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. Marco is the lead author of the Challenging Nuclear Secrecy report. He lives and works in Tamakai, Makarau. I'm sorry, I'm still learning this, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kia ora, Marco.
Thank you, Timothy. Greetings from Tamaki Makaurau. I will be talking and a big acknowledgement to the co-authors on this report, Nick McClellan and Carla Kitakalo, and to all those joining us today. I have a presentation. It's a brief presentation where I'll just talk through the approach and the way that we got to the policy calls. So I'll just try to share my screen now. Sorry, it's not the first slide. Okay. I also have a speech, so I'm trying to get them both on the same. Okay. So the strength of this report lies with the voices that it carries. The initial plan was to interview 6 members of affected communities and researchers, but the positive response that we got from the community meant that we had 17 interviews. The task then became to transcribe 17 interviews and draw connections and commonalities across them. It became a huge task to, sorry, I have to, achieving coherence across the report was obviously the main task. We worked so hard to ensure representation, first across the geographies, the nuclear fuel cycle, and experiences of harms. We were limited by our connections and our experience, of course, and there was, so there's no discussion of nuclear legacies across the former Soviet Union, China, India, Pakistan, South Africa, and Israel. We define nuclear archives broadly, and Carla did an incredible job of summarizing the different types of archives. from conventional repositories like government and university archives to those held in community and in diverse forms like artwork. We might appreciate the difference in audience, purpose, and engagement between, say, the highly technical and often restricted data found in government repositories and affected community testimony, recorded and shared widely through diverse and engaging forms like podcasting. And Nick did a series of case studies to bear this out. The different priorities and engaged in different forms of nuclear archives meant that drawing arguments across the different areas of inquiry was the main task then again too. So we wanted this report to be accessible and useful, to speak with and to those most affected, and to offer policy calls across the different areas. So, sorry, that was my reading part. And so now I'll get to it. So just acknowledging first our amazing contributors. Ray, Matthew, Patrice, Jean-Marie, Marie, Nicole, Milulani, Hinamoyura, Royu, Arjun, Anais, VJ, Claire, Liz, Marie-Helene, Kazuyo, and Janine. So my talk today will be mostly about how we got to the different policy calls. The initial focus, it became very clear early on that drawing the commonalities across the different geographic and temporal spread of nuclear experiences and harms would be very difficult. There were, in their first interviews, it became clear that the ethical issues around the centralization, who controls knowledge about nuclearism, and then who should then lead archival discussions about redressing harms was a very difficult kind of thing. And we acknowledged our own place, with this question of privilege and professional research, that there are not broad opportunities widely for those that are most affected by nuclear harms to gain professional standing in work and to be the ones leading the cause for advocacy. And that the very systems that create nuclear secrecy had created information disparity, which disadvantages some. And so there was this key tension between the academic calls for openness and transparency that were being led by professional researchers and were supported by a whole system of nuclear secrecy, which I'll talk about soon, and then the priorities of affected communities. The other thing from a Nuclear Truth Project perspective, where a lot of work had been done engaging Indigenous communities, members of affected communities, and developing the best practice approaches and carrying forward rights-based foundations like, say, UNDRIP and the humanitarian process in the TPNW, that there would be synergy across this work. And so I want to just talk about the two chapters that talk about the access issues and the ethical issues, and go from the pink, which was the goal, to the blue, which was the policy call. And talk a little bit about some of the key terms that are involved with this report that we came up with and developed in conversation with the interviewees. Again, stressing that the main task was to make sure that when we took our 17 interviewees and tried to, achieve representation and make sure that the report carried forward their priorities and perspectives, that the policy calls were simply an organic reflection of the priorities of those interviewed, conscious of the issues, of course. And so the first part was that in the chapter, I believe it's 3, which is all about access issues, we discussed the operation of nuclear secrecy. So nuclear secrecy is the deliberate concealment or restriction of nuclear information. And the line is that, secrets can be open or closed. When we think of nuclear secrecy, we often think of governments restricting information, and of course they do. But the operation of nuclear secrecy is advanced by other means. And so we came up with these different ways to restrict, scatter, and discredit. Nick has a fantastic explanation of how the French government has scattered across metropolitan France 8 locations, and so it becomes very difficult for those affected, say in Mahuinui, to go and this tiny amount of people that have received compensation is a testament to that. our wonderful interviewers in Japan talked about the discrediting. So we can't simply rely on nuclear information, which is highly technical, to go out into the world and be adequately critiqued, and the biases and omissions that are within that, or the shoddy science that it often represents, be adequately interrogated. And really, states can shape the information climate into which nuclear archives come. So we have this issue where openness doesn't equal accessibility. There are a range of professional researchers that are working on these issues and have developed novel archival strategies. In my own work, and why I kind of came to this project, was I was known for using transnational strategies, finding information, say like leaked telegrams that were in areas like, say, Australian or New Zealand archives that could shed light on the nuclear industrial complex in America, for example. And there are others. And so we tried to develop a how-to guide for those that are getting into this work and can find information elsewhere, or use publicly available information, or to develop kind of partnerships with people in other locations where we can get around some of these practical barriers to access. So what we also found very readily is that, the privilege of having the time, the money, and, say language barriers, means that issues of access start far, far from repositories. And the structures that govern it are governed by privilege, and the researchers' agendas that govern the engagement with nuclear archives are shaped in ways that don't often serve the needs of those most affected. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's the key point here is that when nuclear information comes into this, it doesn't come into an accessible space. And that is the open secret of nuclear secrecy. So we must dismantle the structure. And we need reform. So, in the absence of nuclear truth, and in the absence of openness and transparency, we rely on affected community testimony. It's powerful proof, but it's necessitated by erasure. The reason that affected communities must speak their truths is because they are not otherwise forthcoming. As I said, the structures of privileged access mean that in international advocacy or research, there can be the opportunity for extractive research to take place, or research that doesn't reflect the priorities of affected communities, or doesn't take into account the sensitivities. We always have to be aware that nuclear archives themselves embody violence. They are the product of violence. So when researchers or others, when we share, we have to be wary of attribution, distribution, the ethical issues of stigma, re-traumatization, and cultural sensitivity. Address these issues. But the general structure of privileged access and hierarchical information hierarchy, whereby the dosage estimates of nuclear science, which are deeply undemocratic insofar as it requires advanced degrees in nuclear physics or engineering to understand the Sieverts or the Becquerels, structure the information climate such that there are countless instances, and this is very clear throughout the report, of people being discredited, or the emotion being discredited, such that nuclear truth, and we rely on the rawness and power of affected community testimony and international advocacy and in research. But there are issues of re-traumatization, people being gaslit or re-traumatized when they speak their truth and it comes in and nothing happens. So we have to overturn the structures whereby opportunity is afforded to the privileged at the expense of nuclear affected communities. And so it's the policy call down the bottom, overturning privileged access. Last part was the strategies whereby nuclear affected communities and allies are working and building archival justice. So because affected community testimony is not a substitution for numbers, it has its own priorities. It gives fuller truths. The scientific assessments based on dosage cannot account for the gendered impacts of nuclearism. They can't account for the industrial impacts that the nuclear industrial complex has affected in a whole diverse multitude of ways, and the ways that nuclear legacies are integrated into people's memory, into community memory, and it has become both an ethical issue and an access issue, whereby nuclear affected communities are struggling to access their own truths and the community memory of, say, their ephemera. And this is why I chose this particular location for the webinar, is because behind me are nuclear affected community memory in the form of documents. So as part of this project, but more broadly, been volunteering to catalog and digitize the anti-nuclear movement within Aotearoa. So these are the archives of the Pacific People's Anti-Nuclear Action Committee and the Pacific Concerns Resource Centre when it was here in Aotearoa in 1987. So we rely on these decentralized networks to counter the official narrative and the incredibly inaccessible structure of repositories. Allyship might involve the strategies of translation, offering up the truths and affected community testimony into new areas. It can involve technical assistance like providing cameras. It could be co-produced research that more adequately reflects the priorities of affected communities, or it could simply be more distributed forms where people are given their own money to archive. And so the report discusses strategies and examples where archival justice has been researched in ways that keep community memory in place, to overturn the structures of privileged and hierarchical knowledge, to challenge nuclear secrecy. And Timothy will speak a bit further on the policy calls and their implications and the work that we might build out of this. But as a scoping report, this went from 6 interviews and 20 days of work to a much fuller project, and that reflected the need. And bringing Nick on and achieving representation across geography and across the different effects of nuclear harms, and trying to make sure the report embodied the priorities and perspectives of those doing the work was the main goal. And so thank you for your time.
Thanks, Marco. OCO, everyone. This is Pam Kingfisher here from the Cherokee Reservation in Oklahoma. And it's my pleasure to introduce our other 2 presenters and co-authors on this report. Nick McClellan is a correspondent for Islands Business Magazine out of Fiji and a contributor to PAC News, Inside Story, and others. His book, Grappling with the Bomb, was shortlisted for the EPAA Scholarly Book of the Year in 2019. Nick has reported extensively about nuclear colonialism and resistance in the Pacific Islands and is coming to us from his home in Melbourne, Australia. Carla Cantagallo is a reference librarian at the University of Kentucky. She served as the head of library science. No, she has a master's of science in library science. She has served as a head of reference, the distance learning librarian, and a copyright specialist. Carla lives in Lexington, Kentucky, here in the United States. So Nick and Carla, you want to give us a few of your thoughts on the report?
Sure. Nick,
Thank
turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you for all those who've joined us today. I join you from the the land of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people on Kulin Nation here in Australia. As Marco said, we tried to dig down into the experience of affected communities as they try to gather information about the nuclear era. And I contributed some case studies, particularly on France's role. Between 1960 and 1996, the French government detonated 17 nuclear weapons in Algeria, at that time the French colony of Algérie Française. Then for 30 years in the South Pacific, there were 193 atmospheric and nuclear tests in Maui Nui, French Polynesia. The affected communities in Algeria, in Maui Nui, have been living with the health and environmental consequences to that day, and have been demanding access to information to rebut French claims for many decades that these tests were safe, were clean, and didn't leave lingering impacts. With the end of nuclear testing, there'd been a lot of mobilization around French nuclear testing in the second half of the 20th century. But in the aftermath of testing, affected communities began to organize. From 2001, AVEN, the Association of French Military Veterans who'd served in both Algeria and French Polynesia, and Mururoa et Tatou, Mururoa and Us, an association of Polynesian workers who'd staffed the test sites at Mururoa and Whangatofa, began to organize, began to gather their own testimony, but to seek greater access to nuclear archives in France to gather information that would document their calls for compensation, for cleanup, for reparations. It was a major challenge. The French government established a commission to assist nuclear survivors with compensation in 2010, but in the first 5 years of operation, only 2% of claims were accepted by the French government. So there's been a long struggle dating back decades to access the archives to find out more truth, and gradually that broke down resistance in the French state. And in 2021, the French government agreed to begin a declassification process for nuclear archives. In the last couple of years, tens of thousands of documents have been declassified and made available to researchers, to non-government organizations, to journalists, and so on. But one of the central themes that Marco has already outlined is that there's not an equity in access to these archives. And our report includes case studies about the problems faced for affected communities in Algeria, in Maui Nui, to access information that assists their long-standing claims for nuclear justice. So while it's an important initiative that the French government has buckled to decades of pressure to open up the archives, there are still important inequities in access to the information. One of the problems is that the very sites of archives, although there are websites pointing you in the right direction, are scattered across France. The Château de Vincennes on the outside of Paris, but many sites, and indeed many institutions involved in the nuclear process over decades. For researchers, community activists, affected workers from Tahiti, literally on the other side of the world, access to those archives is very, very difficult in terms of cost, in terms of travel, in terms of the practical logistics of going to France to access that information. Another key restriction is that the declassification process begun in 2021 only includes those for Maui Nui, French Polynesia, and not the tests in Algeria. There's real problems, as Marco suggested, about privileged access, where some researchers are given greater priority access to documents in ways that don't necessarily meet the concerns and priorities of affected communities. And this came out in interviews we conducted both with researchers in France and with people in Tahiti, in Maui Nui. Those interviews also highlighted very different perspectives about the priorities for opening up and documenting the history of the nuclear era. One of the important things that came out of the interviews was the vital role of community archiving, not just accessing state archives, military archives, government archives. There's an important role for gathering the testimony of people in affected communities, of gathering together the ephemera, the history, not only of nuclear survival, but of nuclear resistance, the strong anti-nuclear movements around the world. While there are important environmental organizations from Greenpeace, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, many other organizations who've played a vital role in the nuclear era, affected communities have to gather their own stories. And one of the interesting things we document in the report is examples of people in Tahiti, in Algeria, in the Marshall Islands and beyond, who've been working to develop their own mechanisms through podcasts, through community archives, through storytelling, through art and culture, to look beyond the health and environmental impacts of nuclear testing and to start to document the social history of the nuclear era that so affected their own communities and the broader world. So the case studies we put into the report are trying to give a bit more of a deep dive into the broad principles that we found were quite common across many countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carla.
Well, greetings from the bluegrass state of Kentucky. I'm in Lexington and at the University of Kentucky. I have been a reference librarian for 35 years. And my task in this project was to look at accessible archives in the United States. I could spend another 35 years adding to that document on archives in the United States alone. The list that I created that's on the website is by no means exhaustive. What I tried to do in building that list was think about the people that would be using it. And those are people that probably can't drive across the United States to get to DC, or the overwhelming and daunting task of using NARA, which even for a long time reference librarian is not a friendly resource to use. So I put on my reference librarian hat and thought about all the ways that one can pull information from resources from the community level on up. Especially since I do work at a university, and that brings in issues of privilege too. But at a state university, we do welcome all through our doors, whether that's by phone or in person or by email, to answer questions for people. You do not need to be a student, a faculty member, or a staff person here. So I thought about resources in different communities and did lots of deep dives of research and realized that there are places for affected community members to go that aren't as daunting. So that's through newspaper archives. And luckily in the United States, in the past 35 years, we've done amazing projects in each state, from monies from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and people, archivists, people that have been identified at one place in each state, University of Kentucky for our state, went out and gathered newspapers from around the state and digitized them. So every state in our country has done the same. And these types of archives are searchable and available. So it was looking at resources more on that community level, whether it was historical societies, interest groups, people who have things like Marco has behind him, boxes from community groups. And the issue with archives, as all of you have come to learn, is that they're very often in boxes like Marco has behind them. And it takes time and money and staffing to digitize those and make them available. So as much as we would love to have all that information out there. And hopefully, as each day goes along, more and more of it will be digitized. The list that was started on the website is, I hope, going to be something that ignites curiosity and is a pathway for people to start doing some research and answer questions that they may have, and look for a librarian or an archivist to serve as an ally and start finding what they need without being overwhelmed and distracted and put off the path that they want to be on. So hopefully that list is a good beginning, and it is just a beginning.
Thank you, Carla, and thanks to all three of our presenters and all the research and work that you've done. We have some time for questions. If there's any that you have, just pop them in the chat. We'll monitor that. We'll probably have another little bit of time here. We're at 6:35. So one question for Marco and Nick, you told just a quick story before we started that answers this. If you could tell that, and maybe Marco respond about what barriers have you speakers experienced in your work with nuclear information?
Thanks, Pam. As a journalist and researcher, I've been working with nuclear survivors across the Pacific Islands for many years. One problem is that there are significant restrictions on access to key documents. Writing a book about the British nuclear testing in the Pacific, key documents were restricted from access that provided vital information for the Fijian, Kiribati and New Zealand participants in the British nuclear tests. So that's a key challenge. There are ways around that, however, in terms of looking for other sites where that information might be provided. A second strand is the importance of community testimony. Oral history has many challenges, but provides an incredibly valuable resource to challenge the misinformation that you find in the written record. And one of the major challenges for affected communities is to begin to gather that history from the participants in all of these nuclear testing programs around the region, testimony that's often missed in the official histories that document the role of scientists, of generals, of politicians, but not of the people who actually built the bomb.
Thank you.
I think another thing to add would be that even amongst professionals, research professionals that we've identified, no one is taught how to engage archives. Just as it's, you require a deep technical knowledge to understand measures of radioactivity, the specialized knowledge of how to access information via freedom of information requests or accessing archives, even if you have the privilege, is not taught. So there are the structural barriers of access to official information held in government repositories, or even the official information that was on people's persons that is now in, say, university archives. Accessing it and deciphering it requires a huge amount of resource. And so from a pure resourcing perspective, as well as the different priorities and truths held in affected community testimony, it's a way of inverting the systems of hierarchical knowledge and privileged access that structure the way that nuclear archives function broadly. And just, say with these boxes, for example, I've been researching Aotearoa's role in the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement for a few years. But when I was given these boxes that were held in someone's garage, I was shocked to read that there was actually one or two groups, entire groups that I didn't know of. And these have a way in Aotearoa of challenging dominant national mythology around the way that New Zealand supported nuclearism in the Pacific, which elides the fact that New Zealand was complicit in watering down the Treaty of Rarotonga, in precluding Fijian anti-nuclearism in the early 70s, and the formation of the South Pacific Forum. And so those type of things, I see in the chat, there's a quick discussion, there was a question about, are things leaked or are they accidentally available? And I would say just one or two strategies that might help is, as well as freedom of information requests, the going to places where there is a general openness, or where in people's personal papers where they might not have been vetted very effectively. Those can be ways to gain access to otherwise confidential information. The proviso, of course, is that interpreting that confidential information and the climate in which it comes into is also important, and that nuclear secrecy is upheld not simply by restriction. Thank you.
I think there's a couple of key elements to in this. It is possible to sidestep the restrictions placed by nuclear states. If the War Office files are closed, you may find another department has that information. But in a practical way, it's up to affected communities to work together through South-South cooperation, through working with allies. One example in the Marshall Islands, the Nuclear Claims Tribunal held hearings about the health and environmental consequences of US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. They gathered incredible testimony from nuclear survivors, many of whom were aging or ill, recorded on old audio and videotapes. A local government in Girona, Spain, in Catalonia, offered to help digitize all those irreplaceable records, and that material is available online now as an act of solidarity with the Marshall Islands, which just didn't have the resources to record that material and save it for future legislative, legal, and historical purposes. So it is possible for allies to work together transnationally to support communities, because, of course, most of the nuclear testing was done on indigenous land and waters in poorer communities who often don't have the resources to access the information that's required for long-standing claims.
We've got some great questions in here. Thank you both for those in-depth answers. One of them touches on what you're mentioning around the Tale says the 2025 is a deadline by archivists worldwide for finding and digitizing analog tapes. Given that survivor testimony was core to community and activist research that was done in the 70s through 90s, is there any archives that you found that may be more urgent to digitize before the documentary archives that are at less risk? I know we've talked a lot about this around the islands. What do you think?
Absolutely. Just, you know, as a corollary, just the discussion about the different priorities across the different geographies was really, it was so palpable across the interviews. And in the Pacific, one of the main things was this gap, an intergenerational gap, where in anti-nuclear and resistance, given the suppression of nuclear harms and cultural sensitivities and tapu about the effects on people and bodies. And then in places like Fiji, where there has been governments that have been closed and suppressing activism. People like Claire and Vijay are talking about the difficulty in preserving community memory and having a intergenerational connection to anti-nuclearism and the social movements. And so if I again talk about these boxes, there were only one or two people left and if in the movement that have the boxes. And so this was a very pressing one because, and there are tapes and negatives and those degradable things that Tale talks about. But I think just generally the interest and the having those alive in people's memory, to identify people that are in photos, to talk about the broader context, who was involved, the logbooks of whose handwriting that was. So with identifying and giving context to the documents and the way that we can use the oral history, which is so important in the Pacific, and couple it with the documentary traces that do exist. I think that beyond just the pure preservation aspect, actually getting a full story and full of truths, that is time bound, 100%.
Carla, I
mean,
think I have one
that's-
for you here on the historic US newspapers are behind paywalls. Do we have any sense of how many other relevant archival materials may be trapped in that similar pay-per-view? Thanks.
That's from my wonderful colleague Copana, who knows a lot about newspaper archives. And pardon me, that's my get out of the building bell, which I shall ignore. Not a lot behind paywalls that I've run into. The one thing, if there is a database that you want to get into, you can, of course, travel to. There goes the speaker again, my apologies. And if travel is something you can do, but that's where I think the allyship part comes in that is so important. And, you know, certainly the internet has greatly impacted the profession of libraries and archives, and it's a double-edged sword. There's so much information, and the other side is there's so much information. And one of the major issues with archives is like that, those wonderful boxes behind Marco. Many times the library does not know if they have gotten boxes of things donated, exactly what's in them. And they may not be able to unearth the contents for quite a while. Staffing, financial issues, get those things digitized and put out there. That's why I think looking at oral histories and community actions, there is software out there. Actually, I believe NARA has some on their website that helps communities learn how to preserve and digitize their important works and ephemera. So I think the power, you know, certainly libraries have a lot of information and archives do too, but the archival information is not evident in our catalogs until all that information has been unearthed and processed. So the allyship part and knowing librarians or knowing archivists or knowing activists and that networking of who has what or where those boxes may be and getting them out and digitized and organized is very important. Not a ton of paywalls though that I've run into.
Great. Thank you all for this and for all the questions in the chat. We're trying to respond to a lot of them. And Anais, you asked about the how to approach massive amounts of archives like in France and how we could request funding to support local researchers and activists access to this data. I think we'll be having that conversation as we move forward. So I'm going to turn this over to Dimity now. Talk about our ask.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Marco, Nick, and Carla. Again, we could talk a lot more. There's actually so many aspects to this, as you can see from the report. There's so much that we can talk about in all of this. And thank you all for your wonderful questions and comments and ideas in the chat as well. We'll take note of all of those and try and respond more to them as well in the coming days. Where we are up to now is to have a quick look again. As Marco had pointed out, we have 3 key asks from our report, which is at the back of the report for those of you who have a copy in front of you, which I hope is most of you. Can I get the slides up, Jem, for those? So the first one is that understanding that nuclear secrecy is sustained unjustly and to the detriment of affected communities, we call on states to commit to openness and transparency with their nuclear archives. So the first one is a policy call for states in particular. The second one, which will be coming up, is understanding that privileged and hierarchical access for some has entrenched barriers for affected communities. And so we call on governments, institutions, and civil society to reform such practices. The third is understanding that affected communities maintain community memory in place. We call for greater resourcing for alternatives for archival justice. So each of those three calls are what we will be basing a lot of our work on in coming months and years in our work here. We could talk more about those, but before, I'm just realizing that we're coming up to the hour. We've got about 10 minutes left. Before we go much further, I did want to just touch back to the wonderful team that we have here and ask them a question. And this includes you too, Pam, because we worked over many months together and we had many interesting conversations. And I wanted to know, what were the things that stand out for you all as a team working on this report? Like, what were the things that that process has been like for you all in this report making?
For me,
Okay.
the overwhelming. Sorry,
Go,
Carla.
Marco. No, go.
Amongst professional researchers, there's a large capacity for allyship. For those that affected communities that identified instances of extractive research, or times when, say, a researcher has gone into a community, recorded interviews broadly, maybe received things like family photos, but then only published a small amount of that, or that times where that person has then become an expert on this community and that community and has become an intermediary for access between that community and redress of nuclear harms. Some of these extractive processes or ways that cycles of privilege have created more opportunities for some and contributed to the movement of knowledge out of extractive communities and the building of careers. It's clear to me that this is not necessarily being done intentionally, and that there are ways that professional researchers can build allyship. I was looking into the way that we might, for example, reform research ethics at universities such that there's an obligation to, say, give information back in its entirety or transcribe or put it in accessible forms and repositories. Because at the moment, research ethics in universities are structured towards data security as opposed to data sovereignty in affected communities. So things like that, ways that we might build, help to resource South-South cooperation, where people that have information can resource young people from their communities to maybe, nobody's asking affected communities to travel and, you know, especially say indigenous communities, go and challenge the colonists on their own terms and spend all of this time, you know, looking at literally hundreds of thousands of files. But there are ways that we can keep a resource community memory in place and increase networks across affected communities such that they hold their knowledge, they own their knowledge, that they're the ones utilizing it, they're the ones that remain expertise and gain opportunity from it. And I think that that's kind of what became clear along this thing. We started with the idea that maybe if you create a centralized repository and put all of the reports in there, that people could get information. It became very quick that the structures broadly that govern the way that nuclear information is used to uphold systems of secrecy, uphold extractive and exploitative documentary harms, that this was not enough. So I think the reform needs to be broad. Yeah.
Great, thank you. What about others?
I think for me, one of the striking things was the intergenerational challenges. You know, the underground and atmospheric testing was very much a 20th century phenomenon. People who are directly there, whether as military veterans, as people working on the nuclear test sites, as people in surrounding communities, are aging. How do younger generations access that vital information, given that the health, environmental, social, cultural legacies continue to this day and will continue for future generations with the creation of nuclear sacrifice zones around the world? There are significant challenges that education systems are very poor at documenting the history, not only of nuclear survival, but of nuclear resistance. There are, in many cases, still straight state restrictions, national security restrictions, a fetish about protecting nuclear weapons that restricts access. And obviously in China, in Russia, in France, in other places, there are, security laws that constrain the type of research that needs to be done to document the nuclear era. And I think that's a real challenge. But one of the things that struck me most from the interviews I participated in was the challenge for young people to know the history of what happened, because it continues to this day. Interviewing a young woman in Tahiti who's living with leukemia today, who said, I just didn't know how many tests happened in my own country. Those sort of challenges raise questions. Are the priorities of affected communities for information being addressed? And that's a challenge that's thrown out to journalists, to non-government organizations, to universities, to libraries, to people who want to work with affected communities. Are you resourcing those communities and addressing their priorities for information?
Brilliant. Carla.
I prefer working with all of you, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think it was the interviews and what people said, because as a professional librarian, I think it's incumbent upon us to listen to the people that we ostensibly serve, and researchers and activists and Indigenous people. Everybody is our client base, and to have an opportunity to hear their experiences in their words was wonderful and eye-opening.
Thank you. Well, I will just say it has been a real honor and a privilege and a joy to work with this team on this report. It's been a really powerful and educative thing to do together. And I hope that people who have got the report now will enjoy reading it, reflecting on it, and come back to us with some ideas. Pam, over to you.
Thanks. And I learned so much. I felt like I was kind of just running the Zoom and listening and helping out with a little piece of research. But just again, Nick and Marco, you said it early on, the diversity of viewpoints that we got from the interviews and from all of you was just really great. And for me, my favorite line is, nuclear archives are structured by systems of secrecy and privilege. Accessing nuclear truth requires us to understand how these function and ultimately to dismantle them. So I'm going to go ahead and give an ask here, and good job, y'all. This was really great. That as we distribute this report, and it is on our website, nucleartruthproject.org, that we are starting to work to dismantle these barriers to access. And we would love to hear about any creative community initiatives you know of, or to please share any links to digital nuclear archives that you might use in your country, and any suggestions for developing institutional accessibility and transparency. We'll be exploring strategies for directly affected communities to be at the center of any work to implement Articles 6 and 7 of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we will be sharing this report at the next meeting of states parties in November of this year in New York City. So we invite you to join us by sharing this report in your region and getting involved with us in our ongoing conversations to build on this work. Obviously, we have a lot more to talk about and a lot more to learn about, and other regions as well. We really did a 3-region slice here. So we just really want to develop some strategies together to bring in some of this sunshine of transparency, and as we expose nuclear truths together. So you can sign up for our newsletter or add any links on our contact page. And I think the contacts are up here. So we want to thank everyone who's contributed to our report. The authors here that you'll see interviewed researchers and community activists. You'll see the big list. from the United States, Australia, Fiji, Mahanui, France, and Japan to understand these barriers that restrict access to archives. But a special thanks to our funders, particularly the Plowshares Fund Equity Rises program. We feel very lucky to have been a grantee for Equity Rises, as it aims to continue to disrupt assumptions on how and who has a say in the matter of making the world a more safe and secure world for all. And thanks to ICAN Australia, who've hosted this webinar and so much of our work over the last year. We really appreciate your support and teamwork. So our time's up. We made it on the dot, but we hope this opens a broader conversation on the challenges, opportunities, and ethics of exploring nuclear archives and nuclear accountability overall. So Wado, thank you, everyone. Last thoughts. Thank you so much to our report writers.
Thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoy the report.
Thank you.